Hello everybody, and in this video we're going to be looking at topic 2, lesson 4, example 3, multiplying complex numbers. So they divided in the book, they divided complex numbers into multiplication and division, because division we have to rationalize the denominator, which is a couple of extra steps. It's not like the addition subtraction where they are just kind of straightforward, just like you would do with variables. This one is a little bit different. There are different rules at play for multiplication and division. So how can you write each product in the form of a plus bi? So again, they want us to write these in that complex number form. And looking at this, what we're going to do is we're going to treat it as if it was a variable, but there are certain rules. So if I have I, remember this is the square root of -1. But if I have I squared, what's happening here is we're taking the square root of -1 and we're squaring that. And when we square a square root, it kind of undoes itself, which means that I squared is going to be -1. Now, if we're doing I cubed, this is like saying the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, where this right here is basically the square root of -1 squared times the square root of -1. And we already saw that up here, the square root of -1 squared is just -1. So we get the negative square root of -1, or, I know, long math here, the negative I. So the way this works is if you have I to an even, we either have a plus, or sorry, a -1 or a +1, depending. If it's I squared, you're going to have a -1. If it's I to the 4th, it's going to be positive. Then if you have an I to an odd, it's either going to be a square root, sorry. If you have an I odd, then it's going to be I, or it's going to be -I. So again, if I had I, this is just I, because this is just square root of -1. If I have I squared, this is -1. If I had I cubed, this is -I. If I had I to the 4th, this is actually +1. Because you have square root of -1 squared here times square root of -1 squared here, which is going to be -1 times -1, which gives you that +1 here, and so on and so forth. This is going to be I, this is I to the 6th is going to be -1, and it keeps following that pattern of positives and negatives and positives and negatives. All right, and the whole reason I made that detour, and I'll stay there for a second, or you could pause and you could take these notes. But the reason I made that detour before we start this problem is because this problem, we're going to be looking at multiplying i's together. So I'm going to treat this kind of like it was a variable, and I'm going to distribute it just like normal. So I'm going to do -2.5, sorry, -2.5 I times 8 minus -2.5 I times 9i. All right, so -2.5 times 8 is -20 I minus our plus, because we have a negative times a negative. 2.5 times 9 is going to be 22.5 I squared, because you have an I times an I here. Now remember that little detour we took? I said that I squared is equal to -1. So now we have a -1. plus 22.5 times negative 1, which makes this a negative 22.5. So we have a negative 20. We want to always start with the real number in the front. That's the way it goes, a plus bi. So we're going to do negative 22.5 minus 20i. All that work. We have a second example. I was ready to go. So how can you write this one? So let's look at this one. Again, we're going to use FOIL here. We're going to do the same thing as we would in any other expansion. So I'm going to use FOIL. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 2 is 6i. Negative 2 times 3 is negative 6i. And negative 2 plus 2 is going to be negative 4i squared. This again was that concept that I talked about in example 1 of difference of squares. But in this case, we don't call it difference of squares. We call it the complex conjugate. And with the complex conjugate, it's composed of a plus bi and a minus bi, where a and b are the same integer. Or same number. I guess they could be a fraction as well. And notice the only difference between these two is the sign, plus and minus. And what happens when you have these two signs is you lose this middle term and we're left with an actual real number. So this right here becomes 0. So we have 9 minus 4. Remember what I squared is? I squared is negative 1. So times negative 1. Then we have 9 plus 4, which is 13. We don't have the imaginary part because remember the imaginary part here is 0. This whole complex conjugate idea will show up in the division when we have to rationalize that denominator. So now, you guys, I hope you have a great day and we will catch you in the next video. All right, so if you have any questions or comments, please comment them in Google Classroom and we will see you in the next video. Wait, actually, I lied.